Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Ethos Online. Again, this is a place where we can be, belong, and become the very best version of ourselves. And so, as always, we want to thank you for joining us. Thank you for being a part of this community. And please take a look down below at the descriptions. You'll see there's a way that you can support what we're doing, share what we're doing, just become a deeper part of this community online. We want to thank you again wherever you are. Whether you're in the West Coast, the East Coast, right there in the middle, on your couch, driving, wherever you are, thank you so much for joining us here. So today I want to start. We've been moving through this series called A New Way to Be Human. Again, looking at the deeper picture, the deeper understanding of what it means to be human. And really, we're talking about the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus gets on the mountain and begins expanding on what it means to be more human, to be more loving. But before we step into that, I always like to take some questions. And lately, a lot of you have been sending in really good questions. And so I wanted to just share with you. Here's one of them. And here's a response I think it's pretty relevant. So here's the question. What should I look for in a church congregation? So first off, a lot of listeners, they're kind of in this space where they're not sure where to go. Some people have kind of left church altogether. Other people have said, I still want that sense of community. Some of the things taught there I don't fully believe anymore. Other things I believe in more wholeheartedly. What does a good church look like? Well, how do I know if this is the right fit for me? So for me, when I look at churches, I have a lot of thoughts that come up. First off, I'll go to a church and sometimes I'll appreciate the show and the amount of emphasis they'll put in, hospitality, all that stuff. But then sometimes I'll hear a certain song, that has certain theology, I can't say it, theology in it that I don't believe anymore, and that gets difficult. Other times the pastor may say something or do something that doesn't land well, or the music or whatever. But I think we miss the point when we go that direction. We become kind of critics of the show. And so what I would say is pretty simple. What I would say is look at our motto. Look at our motto. The idea there is belonging, belief, and becoming. Be, belong, become. And so starting with this, it's so important wherever you go, wherever you decide to go, belonging is essential to being human. That need to feel connected and loved and supported, belonging is one of our basic human needs. And so wherever you go as you're church shopping, ask yourself, do I feel like I belong here? Do I feel like I've been embraced here as a human being? Do I feel like these people would support me? Maybe even potentially have friends? Ask yourself those kind of questions when you're there in that environment. Another thing is, obviously, belief is going to be an important part of it. And so, do your beliefs, do your values, do your ethics, do they match with this community? Because if they don't, this is going to be a very torturous venture for you, right? You're going to find yourself frustrated every day. You could feel belonging there, but if the belief doesn't connect with it, you could find yourself at odds more and more and more. And going to this church community could actually become a chore rather than a blessing. So belonging and belief, very important. And lastly, becoming. Does this community, does it help shape people in better ways? Do people leave this place feeling like they're better humans? When you meet people, do they look like people who are becoming? Right? Becoming better and better humans. Are the teachings landing so that you can say, wow, they really do believe what they preach? So for me, my very simple answer to this would be, belong, become. Think of those three B's. They're very basic, but belonging, belief, and becoming, I think if you follow those pretty well, you're not going to be let down with whatever community you land in. So thank you so much for sharing that question. I'm going to continue trying to answer different questions as they come. But as always, please share them. And anytime that this stuff comes up, share these answers with your friends, your neighbors, and put them to use. I've found that they work really well. So moving into the Sermon on the Mount. Again, we understand Jesus. It's written that this Jesus goes up onto the mountain. Again, much like Moses, he goes up onto the mountain and he begins expanding on Torah. Again, a new way to be human and a new way to live in community. That was the basic idea of those 10 commandments, right? And so again, Moses goes up there. He brings down with him this beautiful picture of what life could look like if we learn to live in shalom with the divine in ourselves and our community. And so any Jewish person who is reading the Sermon on the Mount, they immediately make connections to Moses. It's just a very obvious connection there. We've read this over and over again. I think you could probably quote it, right? The Sermon on the Mount is actually a deeper critique into the heart of the law. It reclaims the beauty of living life in harmony. Again, that is the point. It's always been the point. We've found ways to shift that idea, I think, sometimes, but it's always been the point. That has been the main point of Jesus' messages and the Hebrews message in general. And so, important to also remember the context of this time period, right? When Jesus is sharing this message, remember, when this message is actually written and shared, it's 70 AD or post 70 AD. And so the temple was destroyed, right? The Jewish temple, the place where all holy life has been happening, it's been destroyed. And the people there they're thinking maybe our entire way of life is gone, right? Maybe our God has given up on us. Maybe there is absolutely no hope for us anymore. Those are the thoughts that the Jewish people are having. And we know this historically by reading their writings. And so this is the place and this is the time when this message of Jesus surfaces and it's shared with everyone. And the idea, again, is not that God is angry. He needs a sacrifice. Yay, there's Jesus. He'll do. No, that is not the point at all. The point was there is new life just around the corner. And the way to new life, of course, is through the teachings of Jesus, which are really the teachings of Torah. It's always been there. Jesus just becomes the new figure to show what it looks like to live shalom. That's the idea. In a nutshell, it's beautiful. No wonder so many of us keep coming back to these parables and these stories and these teachings. They're just so filled with life. And so the law is given again, 2.0. And so we moved through the happy are you if you do this and this and this. And folks, this is the second to last one we're doing. And it has been so much fun. And so there's two more teachings on this one and one more. And so I want to close with this in just a special way. I want to show you something interesting. Matthew 7:21 through 23. That's where we are. Not everyone who says to me, Master, Master, shall enter into the kingdom of heavens, but he who is doing the desire of my Father in the heavens. Many shall say to me in that day, Master, Master, we have not prophesied in your name and cast out demons in your name and done many mighty works in your name. Again, we've done these things, Jesus, right? Have we not done these things? And then I shall declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you who work lawlessness. So in this interesting image Jesus casts, there's like this moment of like reckoning, right? And this moment, again, I would argue more metaphorical than anything, but there's this moment where like, hey, some of you are claiming to be my followers. Some of you are claiming and aligning yourself with me, but the truth is, I don't recognize you. Do you guys see like the deep picture here? So I want you to notice something right from the get-go, though, I want to touch on, and I find it really, really interesting. Notice this. You do not know me. I don't know you. I don't know you. So the question for me would be simple. How does one know the divine? Right? How does one know the divine? Because that's really the bigger picture here. He's saying, you don't know me. You don't know God. You don't know the stories. You're not participating in them. And so the question, of course, is how do we learn the stories? How do we know the divine? And when I say the divine, it's really fascinating to me because God, that word is a loaded word, isn't it? In our culture, there's a lot of negativity and a lot of positivity associated with it, and there's a lot of in between. The word God has unfortunately become a very worn-out word in our culture. It really has become a meaningless or meaning-packed word, right? So what does it mean? What does God mean? One of my favorite writers says he says this about God. God is love. Love is God. It's an interesting perspective, isn't it? It's almost like a visual, huh? Right? Some people picture God, the divine, however you want to call the mystery, the universe, whatever, however you want to call God. We're not going to argue over it. But some people, they'll use phrases like the mystery, the thing that we just can't understand. And that's God. For many people, God is the thing behind the curtain of evolution. That's God. Some people, God is a literal figure sitting on a cloudy space somewhere up there, looking down, answering prayers, not answering prayers, doing different things, interacting with mankind. Other people see the same picture, except this God doesn't do anything, no interaction, just silently observes. Interesting, right? Another perspective is just it's a very visual one that you can actually kind of perceive today. God is the action of justice in the world. And so God is less being and more action. There's a lot of interesting perspectives on who God is. And so again, the question of how do we know God? Wow, right? There's so many different perspectives of who God is. Then that would mean there's so many different avenues to meet that God. So which one is the right one? Notice this even, philosophers, they're so mixed. They're so mixed on this idea of God. Notice, fools, you think of God as a sentient being. God is the word used to represent a force. All right? Kind of like Star Wars, right? The force created nothing. It just helps things along. It does not answer prayers, although it may make you think of a way to solve a problem. It has the power to influence you, but not decide for you. Interesting take, right? Again, I read all of them so that you might see there are many different perspectives. Another one says this: that has been my personal relationship with God, a connection with the powerful, loving, wise energy in all of us. This is almost like panentheist, right? God is a part of everything, in me, in you, all of it. Interesting kind of perspective from this individual. We can all have contact with each moment in our lives, but it takes commitment and practice, right? We must be willing to move through all our deepest fears, doubts, and misunderstandings. So for her, the way to God is through self-revelation. Interesting, right? And then we have another individual, a very popular writer today. It's really important to understand that God is not an impersonal force. Even though he is invisible, God is personal, and he has all the characteristics of a person. He knows, he hears, he feels, and he speaks. And notice she even uses a lot of masculine words. God is masculine, right? And so for this author, again, God is definitely being. Again, notice the very strong language. All of these perspectives are fascinating. Add on to that, you also have the apophatic tradition that says we can only know God by what God isn't. Are you confused yet? Are you thinking, I don't know what God is? Well, great. That means you're thinking. That means you're asking the deeper questions. So again, God is love, love is God. All of these different perspectives, they leave us wondering, well, how do we see God? How do we know God? I think the easiest way to find an answer to this, it's simple. Jesus says, he who does the work of the Father knows me, has seen God, actually. He who does the work, notice that there's action involved. And so we know the divine by the actions, the good actions we see in the world. Whenever there is goodness, whenever there is love, whenever there is restoration, redemption, forgiveness, whenever there are two people who have been at odds and they come together, or two different groups, when they come together and they find reconciliation, that is what God looks like. Whether literal, metaphorical, that is the action of God in the world. For Jewish people, when they would read about Moses going up onto the mountain, remember that story? He goes up onto the mountain and God gives him the 10 Commandments. But here's the thing, Moses has to turn his face, it says. Why? Because God is so brilliant, so bright, whatever. He turns his face. Now, for the Hebrews, the deep tradition and the understanding there is that Moses, like any of them, could not see God. It's an impossibility. They could only see where God had been. Fascinating, right? We can only see where God has been. And where has God been, of course, is the question. The answer is simple. God has been through the followers, the actions of the followers of the divine. Yeah. You want to see God? You want to see goodness in the world? Follow the followers of these teachings, and you will see it everywhere they go. That's the beauty here. So whichever perspective you have of God, what if you just simply said, I don't know. It's a mystery. I'm going to look for the actions of goodness in the world, and I'm going to follow those. I feel like if we do that, we cannot go wrong. Am I right? Yeah, it's beautiful. Listen to this. Psalm says this. Psalm 119, 112 through 119. And I'll just stop it there halfway through. But it says this: I am determined to obey your rules at all times to the very end. I hate people with divided loyalties, but I love your law. And the psalmist will continue on in this verse about the goodness of the law. Because again, for these individuals, the law, again, we think of law as a very negative thing. But the idea of the law was really essentially the things, the guidelines, the wisdom teachings that bring us closer to understanding ourselves, community, and the divine. That's what the law was. And so I love the law. And so when we live the law, we learn to embody it, right? We resemble the divine in action. And so I've been meaning to say something about this. And maybe I'll do it now, right? We right now in this time in our country's existence, in our history, June 4, 2020, we've gone through COVID-19, and now we're experiencing some rioting, and we're experiencing some protesting, and we're experiencing a lot of division. And so just recently, we had a terrible, horrific incident happen. And there was some police brutality. And George Floyd, he was murdered. He was killed. We could say killed. Let's say killed. He was killed there by a police officer, and many would call this brutality. We saw the videos of a police officer kneeling on the throat of this man for 9 minutes. And it was painful, and it caused in some of us pain, caused in others of us anger, some of us sadness, some people just complacency. It did a lot of different things, but what happened is anytime you see something like this take place in the world, something comes to the surface. One of those things I just mentioned, they come to the surface, and different movements will rise. And the question, of course, that Jesus is essentially getting at the heart at is, which movement do you follow? Which movement brings life? Which movement is an action of the divine, and which one's not, right? So when we look at these different movements and these actions, some are obvious, like this, for instance. We know without a shadow of a doubt, Derek Chauvin, his actions that day to this man, they were wrong. We know without a shadow of a doubt that police brutality, it does happen. It happens to many different people, right? Whichever race, culture, country, wherever you're from, it happens. And we know it's wrong. And so we watched as this police brutality happened. And we know, or at least we hope we do, I hope you do, that this action is not part of the divine. The divine is not causing this to happen. A divine follower does not do these things. This police brutality is not a movement worth following. It does not bring life. Think of the individual of Derek Chauvin. And again, I hate to demonize people. That's not at all what I'm intending to do. But is he someone that we should rise up and follow? Well, no. Do a little bit of research on Google, right? Do a little bit of research. And I know I've heard, and again, for me, it's crazy. There are groups of people who are calling him a hero. Is he a hero? Well, look, Chauvin was the subject of 18 prior complaints filed against him in Minneapolis Police Department. 18. He has a long record of this. He's extremely violent background. He's been suspended twice. He is not where you look for the divine. It's not. And a movement centered around him is simply not going to be a movement worth following. Yeah, interesting, right? Does the divine look like this? Just look at that picture for a moment. Is that what the divine looks like? Rioting and looting. Is that where you find God? Is that where you find goodness, love, forgiveness, reconciliation? Tipping cars over, taking bricks, throwing them into individuals, white, black, red, yellow, whatever, into their storefronts. Is that going to bring life? Some would argue no. Actually, the very opposite, more divisiveness. Is that movement, that action worth following? I think maybe you can decide that one. I want to go even more controversial with you for a moment. I will say over and over again, the death of George Floyd was wrong. It was horrendous. It was bad. It was not the will, the call, what followers of the divine do. Not at all. A Christ follower does not do that. But here's my other question. Is George Floyd a hero? Is George Floyd someone that we stand up and follow? George Floyd. I want you to think about George Floyd for a moment. And again, I'm just being very honest and open with you right now. George Floyd landed 5 years behind bars in 2009 for an assault and robbery against a pregnant woman. This guy has a very long rap sheet. He had fentanyl and metamorphosines in his body when he was arrested. He was high. Some even argue that there was a bag of white stuff there. You know, there are pictures that are surfacing about this. At the time he was arrested, he was arrested for counterfeit money as he was high, right? Is this someone we follow? Do we follow in the footsteps of George Floyd? Is following the footsteps of George Floyd going to bring life? Well, you answer that. I'll let you answer that. But here's the deeper question for me. Where are the voices of life? In the middle of all of this, because I've posed some questions for you. Where are the voices of life? Which are the movements we follow? Which ones do we follow that are going to bring life? Which are the Christ-like movements? Well, for me, I've seen some. One of them is this. It's the group of people, and many of them were protesters who saw the violence and the anger of other individuals there, saw the looting and the violence, and the next morning, they got up with their bags, their trash bags, and they cleaned, and they offered help to different store owners. Community members rose up, and they answered the call when people were hurting and in need. There was a group of people who followed the divine in a really beautiful, interesting way here. They followed love, right? That movement, I would argue, is worth following. Here's another story you probably haven't heard because it's not on the mass media very much, because it's not really one that would hype people up and get them excited, right? But here it is. This is David Dorn. David Dorn, 70 plus years old. He was a retired cop. And he stood in front of a pawn shop there in St. Louis, stood in front of the pawn shop as looters and different angry protesters, rioters, all these different people, they were trying to throw bricks and break into the pawn shop. And David saw the injustice of it, and he said, "Please stop." He tried to stand between them and the building. And what happened was he was shot. He was shot to death, and people have even videoed him just laying on the ground, shot to death. He was trying to fight for justice. He was attempting to do the right thing. Where is the divine? I would argue the divine was seen in David, standing up against the destruction and the looting and the anger and the violence. It's beautiful. Where else do we see the divine? I would say we see the divine in protest. Definitely. When there's injustice, groups of people who, like Jesus, stand and peacefully protest, right? And one could try to make the argument, well, he flipped tables. Different, very different than going out and robbing people's stores, tipping over literal cars, murdering people. That's different, right? That is a very different thing. Jesus, he protests, right? But it is a peaceful protest. There were no people or animals harmed. There was no looting going on there in that moment when he's in the temple. That is just a really poor connection to attempt to make. But there are protesters that are actually going out and they're peacefully protesting. And they're saying things must change. There is far too much police brutality, and they're standing against it. And they're saying, we want our voices to be heard. We're not going to fight you. We're not going to loot you. We're not going to riot. We're not going to do these things. But we will stand in solidarity together and hope that others join us so that you can see that there is a problem. America has a deep problem with violence, and groups of people coming together to protest that. I would argue the divine is all over that. It's beautiful. Jesus, I find it really fascinating. Jesus over and over again shows us the example of what the divine looks like. Over and over and over again. This is what shalom looks like when it walks among us. This is what the temple looks like when it breathes, right? So when you look at Jesus, everywhere Jesus goes, there's healing, right? There's no wonder all of these crowds, the stories say, people would gather around Jesus. People don't gather around an angry, violent person, right? They will use him to stir media, right, and various things. But that people don't gather for healing around that kind of person. They don't gather around a Barabbas. No, they gathered around Jesus. They understood Jesus is where healing was. Jesus is where restoration is. Jesus, he caused division, didn't he? Yeah, wherever Jesus goes, he says, I haven't come to bring peace, I've come to bring a sword, right? And the idea here, metaphor, of course, right? The sword is a metaphor. The idea here is that love and enemy love, forgiveness, protest, these things do cause division, and why wouldn't they? But the deeper intention behind it is to bring connection and restoration. Always. You always see that with Jesus. Another thing, Jesus brought injustice to light. Whenever the religious system was abusing its power, it was brought to light. Jesus found ways to bring it to light. And I would argue followers of Jesus, the ones who know him and he knows them, right? That idea there. Followers of the divine, love, goodness, however you want to describe God, everywhere they go, there's so much light, so much goodness. They're spreading that darkness flees, right? We get that metaphor in the Bible over and over again. The idea there is injustice has no room, and it's brought right out in the open to light. Everywhere Jesus went. Another thing interesting about Jesus, Jesus taught enemy love. Jesus did not seek to put a bunch of labels on people. He wasn't saying, you have this and you have that, blah, blah, blah. Jesus was never victimizing himself. You don't see that either. Jesus over and over again. What's beautiful about the message of Jesus is that he taught even though our enemies are hurting us, even though there's injustice in the world, we still find ways to love the people oppressing us and hurting us. That does not mean we say it's okay, right? It doesn't mean we become doormats, but what it does mean is we find a way to see the very best in the worst of culture and society. Yeah, interesting take, right? We learn to love our enemies. It's an interesting idea and probably the hardest thing in the world to follow. Another thing is, Jesus spoke on forgiveness over revenge. Yeah, it was never the idea, Jesus' messages were never that, hey, if someone does you wrong, turn around, hit them over the face, right? If someone riot and loots you, turn around and steal their stuff, right? That was not the message of Jesus. That, unfortunately, is the message of the masses. But a follower of Jesus, someone who is walking in the steps of the divine, they are going to find a way to forgive, not seek revenge. And then lastly, Jesus, he saw the system as broken, right? Not people. Not people. Everywhere Jesus went, there were broken people, right? There were hurting people, but he didn't sit there and condemn them. He always condemned the system, the religious system, the political system. He said, those are the things that need fixing. They're broken. They need fixing. And you would see most of his critique is almost always geared toward that. Because I think deep down, most of us understand when we turn arguments, when we turn movements against people, we always create victims. Always. But when we turn movements against systems that need to change, that's where we see good things take place. That's where we can experience love and forgiveness and restoration. So if I could sum up the words of Jesus, I might say something like this. Not every movement and voice brings life. Watch their actions. You want to know if a movement's bringing life? Watch the actions of its followers. It is so simple, so plain, and so easy. Is a movement worth following? Watch their actions. Because anyone can scream all day about anything. But if their actions don't follow, then it's probably not a movement worth following. So how do we do it? How do we do it? Here's some things that I would argue help in deciding if a movement is worth following or not. Number one, listen to all voices concerned. For me right now, I'm learning that there is a certain narrative, right? There is a Democratic and a Republican narrative. They're both there, right? We have these political narratives, we have socioeconomic narratives, all of them. But what I'm finding in our culture right now is one movement is taking a hold of one perspective from one community. And if we want to be well-grounded and thoughtful individuals, I think it's so important that we listen to all the voices. Because sometimes I think we find that some voices don't always agree, especially in our culture right now. There in the Black community are conservative voices and liberal voices. And as a white individual, I'm learning it is so important that I listen to both. Yeah, listen to all the voices concerned. Another one is this: recognize your own personal biases and seek to observe other perspectives. It is so important for me when I'm trying to decipher whether a movement is bringing life or not, whether it is following the divine or not, so important for me to first off say, I have some biases. I have some ideas that they just always come up in my thinking. And if I can recognize that from the get-go and understand that that is swaying me to move in a certain direction, sometimes, and hopefully the majority of the time, I can stop and I can say, whoa, hold on. This is making me miss a deeper perspective here. Another one, look at what they do over what they say. Yeah, that one I think is so important. The actions of a movement, the actions of a group, their message should always follow with actions that connect to the message. If they don't, not worth following. Do their actions bring healing or more pain and suffering? Right now, I think it's pretty evident. There's a movement, and within that movement, there are different actions. Sometimes they bring life, sometimes they don't. Which element of that movement will you follow? Which movement will you find brings life? For a follower of Christ, it is so important that we recognize the movements to follow, the people to hold on a pedestal, are the ones that are following in the Christ path. They're looking to bring restoration and life everywhere they go. They're following in the footsteps of Jesus. So again, I might say, not every movement and voice brings life. Watch their actions. Everyone, thank you so much for joining me today. As always, please consider giving to ethos-church.org/donate. Give there for a tax-deductible donation. We so appreciate the help you give. Please consider donating there, walking with us in this journey. Also, share these messages with people. We think what we're doing brings life. Also, Ethos Living Rooms. Every first and third of the month, we do these. And so essentially, we come together via Zoom, and we have these really interesting discussions live over faith and deconstruction and the messages of Jesus, all of it together. And it is so life-giving. I think you would really enjoy it. So please email me at tonywerfel@gmail.com, and I'd love to send you that link, put you on our our email address forms and everything. We'd love to get you connected. We'll get you that newsletter every week. And then lastly, subscribe. Hit that subscribe button so that you're notified every time there's a new video. Everyone, thank you so much. We love you. We appreciate you. And next week will be the conclusion of this series. And man, has it been fun. I hope you've enjoyed it. Take care. We'll see you next week. Bye.